The highway stretched endlessly before Mike Calloway, a seasoned trucker who had seen every corner of the country from the confines of his 18-wheeler. He had been driving for over 20 years, and though the job wore on his bones, it paid well enough to keep him moving. Tonight was different, though. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, the kind that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. He was hauling a shipment of refrigerated goods through a desolate stretch of Nebraska, a road so empty it might as well have been a forgotten artery of the earth. The last truck stop was 200 miles back, and his next stop wasn't for another 300. As the night deepened, the hum of the tires on the asphalt became hypnotic. His headlights cut through the void, illuminating a road that seemed to fold into itself. That's when he saw it, a lone figure on the side of the road, thumb extended in the universal gesture of desperation. At first, Mike considered driving past. Hitchhikers were a risk, and he didn't like the idea of picking up some drifter in the middle of nowhere. But something about this guy was off. He wasn't dressed for the cold, just a tattered hoodie and jeans. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Mike could see his lips moving. He wasn't shouting for help, though. He was mouthing something over and over again. Mike's gut twisted, and he made the call to drive past. As he did, he stole a glance in his side mirror, and his stomach dropped. The man's head snapped toward him, his face fully visible now, and Mike could swear the guy had no eyes. Just smooth, pale flesh where his sockets should have been. He stomped the gas pedal, sending the rig surging forward, his hands tightening on the wheel. His breath came in quick gasps as he tried to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe he was exhausted. Maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the uneasy feeling didn't fade. In fact, it got worse. His CB radio crackled to life. "Breaker 19, came a static-filled voice. "You see that guy back there?" Mike's blood turned to ice. He grabbed the receiver. "Who is this?" Silence. A sharp laugh crackled through the speaker, distorted and wrong, like someone playing a recording backwards. Then, just as suddenly, the radio went dead. Mike turned it off, his hands trembling. He had never been one to scare easy, but something about this stretch of road felt infected. And then, the worst thing happened. In the mirror, in the glow of his taillights, he saw the same hitchhiker standing on the shoulder of the road. But that was impossible. He had left him miles back. There was no way he could have gotten here ahead of him, unless he had never really been human to begin with. Mike swallowed hard. Hell no. He wasn't stopping. He wasn't slowing down. As he pressed the pedal harder, the engine roared in protest. The miles blurred together, but no matter how fast he drove, he couldn't shake the eerie sensation that something was riding with him, hidden just out of sight. And then, something knocked from inside the trailer. 3 slow, deliberate thuds. Mike's hands went numb. His cargo was supposed to be dead weight, sealed, checked, and accounted for before he left the depot. But someone, was inside. Mike's heart pounded like a war drum as he gripped the wheel tighter. The knocking from inside the trailer had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just a loose pallet shifting, a rat? No. That knock was too deliberate, too human. He reached for his CB radio again, flicking it on. "Breaker 19, anyone got ears on this channel? I got something in my trailer that shouldn't be there." Static. Then, after a long pause, a voice crackled through. It was hoarse, whispery. "Don't stop," Mike's skin crawled. "Who is this?" Silence. And then the laugh returned. That same warped, backward-played laughter like something unnatural was mocking him. His foot pressed harder on the pedal. He needed to reach the next stop, somewhere with lights, cameras, people. The truck rattled as he sped down the highway, his headlights cutting through the black void ahead. He checked the mirrors again, half expecting to see the hitchhiker standing in the middle of the road. But he wasn't there. Instead, the reflection showed something far worse. A handprint, smeared in something dark and thick, was pressing against the inside of the trailer door's window. Mike nearly swerved off the road. His chest tightened as cold sweat beaded on his forehead. Who the hell was inside his trailer? His mind flicked back to the loading dock, to the moment he checked the locks. He knew for a fact they were sealed. There was no way in unless someone had gotten in before the doors were shut, or unless something else was in there. The knocking returned. 3 steady thuds, each one louder than the last. Mike reached under his seat, fumbling for his crowbar. If this was some drifter trying to steal a free ride, they were about to regret it. He had just wrapped his fingers around the cold metal when, bang, a deafening slam came from inside the trailer, as if something massive had thrown itself against the walls. The entire truck lurched, forcing him to fight the wheel to keep it steady. Then, his headlights flickered. A moment of darkness swallowed the road before they sputtered back to life. But in that brief second, Mike saw something that made his breath hitch. Standing in the middle of the road, directly ahead of him, was the hitchhiker. His arms were spread wide, his eyeless face grinning. Mike made a split-second decision. He wasn't stopping. He braced himself and plowed forward, meowed forward. But the second his truck should have hit the figure, there was nothing. Just open road. Mike's stomach churned, his knuckles white against the wheel. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He needed to stop. He needed to check the trailer, even if every bone in his body told him not to. A mile ahead, a deserted truck stop appeared like a beacon. The neon "Open 24 Hours" sign flickered, half the letters dead. He pulled in, tires screeching against the pavement. He jumped down from the cab, crowbar in hand, and marched to the back of the trailer. The lock was still intact, just as he had left it. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked it and threw the doors open, and more, and felt his blood turn to ice. Inside the trailer, every single box was torn open. Their contents, a shipment of frozen meat, were ripped apart. The plastic packaging, shredded like an animal, had been gnawing through them with desperate hunger. And at the very back of the trailer, something moved. A shadowed figure crouched in the darkness, its skeletal limbs twisting unnaturally as it turned toward him. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones, and when it smiled, Mike saw rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. It took a single, trembling step forward and whispered in the hitchhiker's voice, "Got room for one more?" Mike stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. His mind screamed at him to move, to slam the trailer door shut, to run. But his body was frozen. The thing inside the trailer cocked its head, its bony fingers twitching as it took another step forward. "You're late, driver," it rasped, its voice a perfect echo of the hitchhiker's. Except now, up close, it had a second, deeper voice layered underneath, as if something else was speaking along with it. Mike snapped back to reality. Nope. 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 With a surge of adrenaline, he kicked the trailer doors shut and locked them in one motion. The creature let out a sharp, guttural scream, throwing itself against the metal walls. The entire trailer shook violently, the force rattling the chains. Mike didn't wait. He ran, sprinted back to the cab, wrenching the door open and jumping inside. His hands fumbled for the keys, nearly dropping them before jamming one into the ignition. The engine roared to life. As he yanked the gear shift into drive, the truck lurched forward. His heart pounded as he floored the gas, tearing out of the truck stop, leaving nothing but the red glow of his taillights behind. For a moment, the pounding on the trailer stopped. Silence. Mike gripped the wheel, his breath still coming in short bursts. Maybe, just maybe, he had trapped it. Then, from the passenger seat, a voice whispered, "Why'd you leave me behind, Mike?" Cold fear choked him. The hitchhiker was in the cab with him. Mike's hands trembled as he turned his head ever so slightly, just enough to see the passenger seat. And there he was. The same eyeless face, the same tattered hoodie, the same twisted grin. The hitchhiker had never been outside the truck. He had been inside with Mike the whole time. The thing tilted its head, its skin stretching unnaturally as it grinned wider. "Don't look so scared," it crooned. "We've got miles to go." Mike did the only thing he could think of. He yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck veered off the road, tires screaming against the asphalt. The world spun as the massive vehicle tipped onto its side, skidding across the pavement in an explosion of sparks. Metal shrieked, glass shattered, then blackness. When Mike came to, the truck was still, resting on its side in a ditch. His head throbbed, blood trickled down his temple. His seatbelt had saved him from being thrown, but the cab was crushed, the windshield caved in. And then he realized, the passenger seat was empty. Mike's breath hitched. He turned his head, scanning the wreckage. The trailer doors had burst open, their cargo spilling onto the highway. The frozen meat was scattered, torn apart, but the thing that had been inside, gone. Something moved in the distance. A shape, tall and thin, stood on the edge of the road, watching him. Its eyeless face tilted slightly, as if considering him. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the dark, melting into the trees. Mike sat there, panting, his heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever it was still out there. And it wasn't done with him yet. Mike sat in the wreckage of his truck, his pulse a frantic drum in his ears. His fingers dug into the torn leather of the seat, the sting of fresh wounds barely registering. The thing, whatever it was gone. But somehow that felt worse, because that meant it could be anywhere. A distant howl echoed from the tree line. Not a coyote, not a wolf. Something wrong. The kind of sound that clawed into your bones and made your instincts scream to run. Mike forced himself to move. His legs felt like lead as he kicked the twisted door open and stumbled out, boots crunching against shattered glass. The highway was empty, stretching into the abyss of night in both directions. The only sign of life was the flickering neon sign from the truck stop in the distance. He had two choices: stay with the wreck and wait for help, risking that thing coming back, or make a run for the truck stop and pray to God someone was there. Mike didn't think twice. He ran. Every step was agony. His ribs screamed in protest, his lungs burned, but he kept moving. He could feel it, that presence behind him, just beyond the edge of the road, hiding in the dark spaces where the light didn't reach. Watching. The truck stop loomed ahead. The parking lot was nearly empty, one other semi, a beat-up sedan. The gas pump stood silent under buzzing fluorescent lights. The moment Mike hit the pavement, he slammed through the glass doors. The clerk, a wiry kid barely out of his teens, jumped. "Dude, you okay?" Mike didn't answer. His eyes darted to the security cameras mounted in the corners. If he could just see it, if he could prove to himself that this thing was real. The screens behind the counter flickered with grainy black and white footage of the lot outside. Nothing. Just his overturned truck, his scattered cargo. No movement, no hitchhiker. Mike's stomach twisted. He knew it had been there. It had been right behind him. The clerk gave him a wary look. "You, need me to call someone? Cops?" Mike's mouth was dry. "Yeah." His voice came out rough, like he'd swallowed broken glass. "Yeah, call the cops." The kid nodded and grabbed the phone. Mike exhaled, finally allowing himself to think. Maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe the crash had shaken something loose in his brain, made him imagine. The lights flickered. The hum of the fluorescents warbled. The air thickened like the whole building had inhaled. Then the security monitors glitched. For a fraction of a second, the image distorted. And in that brief, cursed moment, Mike saw it. Standing in the lot, facing the camera, grinning. The screen cut to black. A sharp gasp escaped the clerk. Dude, what the hell was that?" Mike didn't answer. He was already backing away from the counter, already looking toward the glass doors. Outside, the lights in the parking lot started dying, one by one. A slow, deliberate knock echoed against the glass. Mike turned. The hitchhiker stood just outside the door, his eyeless face pressed against the glass, that too-wide grin stretching across his face. "Time to go, Mike." The glass shattered. The last thing Mike heard before the darkness took him was the clerk screaming. They found the wreckage of Mike's truck the next morning. A ghost white, ice-covered corpse was discovered in the trailer, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. But it wasn't Mike's body. Mike Calloway was never found. Some say he ran, disappeared off the grid. Others think he was just another trucker who lost his mind on the long haul. But those who've driven that stretch of road at night, those who know the stories. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the road is empty, truckers still hear the knock on their trailer doors. And when they check their mirrors, they see a man standing on the side of the road, thumb out, grinning. The rain had been coming down in thick sheets for the past 3 hours. Joe Matheson gripped the wheel of his 18-wheeler, his knuckles stiff and white against the leather. The road stretched out ahead of him, a lonely, dark ribbon slicing through the Wyoming backcountry. His headlights barely cut through the swirling fog that had settled over the empty highway. It was the kind of night that made truckers nervous. The kind of night where strange things happened. Joe was no rookie. He'd been on the road for over 20 years, and in that time, he'd seen his fair share of weirdness. Lights in the sky that moved too fast for airplanes, shadows darting across the road when no animals were around. But what he saw tonight? That was different. Around mile marker 237, his headlights caught movement on the shoulder of the road. A figure. A man, tall and thin, standing perfectly still in the rain, his clothes hanging off his frame like they were 3 sizes too big. Hitchhikers weren't uncommon, even out here in the middle of nowhere. But something about this one sent a chill down Joe's spine. The way he stood, rigid, unshaken by the cold or the rain, staring straight ahead. Joe wasn't the kind of guy to leave someone stranded, especially in weather like this. He slowed the rig, rolling to a stop just ahead of the man. The hitchhiker moved toward the passenger door, but Joe noticed something strange. The man's shadow stretched too long across the wet asphalt, bending unnaturally in the dim glow of the taillights. Joe hesitated, but forced himself to reach across and unlock the door. It groaned as it swung open, and the man climbed in without a word. "Where you headed, friend?" Joe asked, flicking the heat up a notch. The man smelled of wet earth and something else, something sour, metallic, like rusted metal left in the rain too long. The hitchhiker turned his head slowly, his face just barely illuminated by the dashboard lights. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His lips barely moved as he spoke. "Anywhere but here," he whispered. Joe chuckled uneasily, pushing the truck back into gear. "Well, I can get you as far as Cheyenne." The man didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, hands folded in his lap, fingers too long, too bony. Joe swallowed, gripping the wheel tighter. The man's presence made the cab feel smaller, the air thicker. The radio crackled suddenly, static washing over the speakers. Then a voice, Joe's own CB handle, whispered in a distorted, broken tone. Big Iron, you shouldn't have stopped." Joe's heart slammed against his ribs. His CB was off. He glanced at the hitchhiker, but the man hadn't moved. His lips curled slightly, just enough to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too pointed. Joe's stomach churned. He had made a mistake, a very big mistake. Joe's pulse hammered in his ears. The air inside the cab had turned thick, suffocating, like he was breathing in smoke. He kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles ached. The hitchhiker sat unnervingly still, his long fingers curled slightly in his lap. His eyes, sunken and dark, reflected the glow of the dashboard like twin black mirrors. Joe forced a chuckle, trying to shake the unease creeping up his spine. "That was weird, huh? Must be some interference from another truck." The hitchhiker didn't reply. Joe reached for the CB radio, twisting the knob to see if anyone else was on the frequency. Static. Pure, unbroken static. Then, Big Iron, you shouldn't have stopped." The same distorted voice as before, but this time it was closer, louder. Joe slammed the CB off. His hands were shaking. He swallowed hard and forced himself to focus on the road. The rain had eased up, but the fog was thicker than ever, rolling over the highway in dense waves. The taillights of another vehicle appeared faintly ahead, barely visible through the mist. Joe exhaled. Another trucker? Maybe he was just psyching himself out. Maybe he'd been on the road too long, and fatigue was making him see things that weren't there. He stole a glance at the hitchhiker. The man hadn't moved, hadn't shifted an inch since getting in. Joe's stomach twisted. Then the man smiled. Not a normal smile. His lips stretched too far, peeling back from rows of teeth, too many teeth, sharpened like needles. Joe's breath caught in his throat. He turned back to the road, hands clammy on the wheel. His foot pressed harder on the gas. "Where did you say you were headed again?" Joe asked, his voice strained. The hitchhiker slowly turned his head, his neck making a sickening pop. "I never said." Joe's mouth went dry. He stole another glance, just for a second. The hitchhiker was gone. Joe's foot slammed the brakes. The rig screeched, tires skidding over wet asphalt as his heart pounded against his ribs. The truck came to a stop in the middle of the highway, the engine rumbling. He turned, his chest heaving. The passenger seat was empty, but the door had never opened. He would have heard it. He would have seen it. Joe wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers trembling. He reached for his phone, but there was no signal. Then a whisper. Right against his ear. "You shouldn't have stopped." Joe spun around so fast he almost fell out of his seat. The cab was empty. His breaths came quick and shallow. His hands were damp, the steering wheel slick beneath his grip. He needed to get the hell out of here. Now. Slamming the truck into gear, he pressed on the gas. The rig lurched forward, tires gripping the road as he sped down the highway, swallowing the eerie silence that followed. For miles, he didn't let up. He kept checking the mirrors, expecting to see something lurking in the back of the cab. But there was nothing. Just the fog. Just the empty road. And then, the highway lights flickered. A figure stood on the side of the road just ahead, silhouetted in the mist. Joe's stomach dropped. It was him, the hitchhiker, standing exactly as he had before, unmoving, staring straight ahead. Joe's vision blurred. His breathing turned ragged. His hands shook against the wheel. And then the voice came through the CB radio again, clearer than ever. "You can't leave me behind, Joe." Joe's foot slammed the brakes again, but this time, before he could react, the world tilted. His rig jackknifed. The sound of metal screeching against pavement filled his ears. The truck spun. Headlights swirled in his vision. And then, darkness. Pain. That was the first thing Joe felt when he came to. A sharp, searing pain radiating through his ribs, his skull pounding like someone had taken a hammer to it. His vision swam as he tried to open his eyes, but all he saw was a shifting haze of red and black. He was still in the cab, or what was left of it. His rig had come to a twisted, screeching halt on the side of the road, metal groaning as it settled into place. The windshield was shattered, and blood dripped down his temple. The world outside was a blur of fog and darkness. Joe gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright. His body screamed in protest, but he had to move. He had to get out. His fingers fumbled for the seatbelt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, a noise. A slow, deliberate knock against the driver's side window. Joe froze. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. His hands trembled against the wheel. Slowly, he turned his head. A face stared back at him through the shattered glass. The hitchhiker. Joe's breath caught in his throat. The man's face was wrong. His eyes were sunken even deeper. His skin stretched too tight over his skull. His mouth hung open in an unnatural grin, exposing teeth that were longer now, more jagged, curving inward like hooks. The hitchhiker raised one long, bony hand and knocked again. Knock. 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 Joe's entire body locked up. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his limbs refused to cooperate. The air in the cab felt thick, suffocating, like something unseen was pressing down on his chest. The hitchhiker tilted his head, his mouth stretching wider. "Let me in, Joe." Joe sucked in a sharp breath. His mind raced. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His shaking fingers found the door handle, but he didn't pull it. He slammed his weight against it instead, forcing the damaged door open with a metallic screech. The moment he hit the ground, pain shot through his leg, but he ignored it. He scrambled forward on unsteady legs, stumbling away from the wreckage. Don't stop. Don't look back. The wind howled through the trees lining the deserted highway. The fog swirled, thick as smoke, and for a terrifying moment, Joe couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. His lungs burned as he forced himself forward, limping down the road. Behind him, something moved. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching against the gravel. Joe didn't look. He couldn't. Then he heard it. The sound of a second set of footsteps. To his left, then another. To his right. Joe's chest tightened. His breaths came in sharp, panicked gasps. He wasn't just being followed, he was being surrounded. The fog shifted ahead of him. Shapes emerged from the mist, figures, tall and thin, their bodies unnaturally still. There were more of them, all identical to the hitchhiker. All staring at him. Joe stumbled back, his heart pounding against his ribs. He turned to run, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Cold, freezing cold. The hitchhiker's voice slithered into his ear. "You shouldn't have stopped." Joe's scream never made it past his lips. Joe's body seized up. The hand on his shoulder was ice cold, its grip like iron, pressing down with unnatural strength. His breath hitched in his throat as he felt the fingers dig into his skin, something sharp pressing into his flesh like claws. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figures in the fog stood motionless, watching. The same faces, the same grinning, hollow-eyed expressions. Joe tried to force words out, but his throat felt like it was closing. The hitchhiker leaned in closer, his breath cold and damp against Joe's ear. "You can't leave me, Joe." Joe's pulse slammed against his ribs, his vision blurring at the edges. "No. No, this isn't happening. His body screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something, but the hitchhiker's grip was like a vice. And then, a deep, guttural rumble cut through the night. Joe's eyes snapped to the highway behind them. Headlights, a truck, a big one, barreling toward them, its engine growling like a beast. The high beams cut through the fog, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Joe felt something he thought he'd lost. Hope. With every ounce of strength he had left, he threw himself backward, ripping free from the hitchhiker's grip. His body hit the pavement hard, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. He scrambled onto his hands and knees, waving his arms wildly as the truck came closer. The driver lay on the horn, a long, deafening blast. Joe barely had time to roll out of the way as the truck roared past him, its wheels skidding on the wet asphalt. His heart pounded as he turned to look. The hitchhiker was gone. No figures in the fog, no eerie whispers, just the empty road stretching out behind him. Joe collapsed onto his back, his chest rising and falling in shaky, uneven breaths. His hands were still trembling, his skin slick with sweat. The other truck had pulled over a few yards away, its brake lights glowing red in the mist. A man jumped down from the cab, running toward him. "Jesus Christ, buddy, you okay?" Joe tried to respond, but his throat felt raw. His lips barely moved as he gasped, Did you see him?" The driver frowned. "See who?" Joe turned his head, scanning the highway, but there was nothing. No hitchhiker, no figures in the fog, just the wreckage of his rig, the shattered glass glinting under the truck's headlights. He swallowed hard. The guy, the one standing in the road. The driver's face darkened. He looked toward the wreck, his jaw tightening. "I didn't see anyone, man, just you." Joe felt his stomach churn. His hands balled into fists as he forced himself to sit up. It wasn't real. It couldn't have been real. But his shoulder still ached, the imprint of ice-cold fingers lingering in his flesh. His skin burned where those claw-like nails had dug in. And deep down, in the part of his mind that he didn't want to listen to, he knew the truth. The hitchhiker had been real. And somewhere out there on some empty stretch of highway, in the dead of night, he still was. Joe never stopped for hitchhikers again. Not once. Not ever. The road stretched into infinity, a black ribbon cutting through the vast, empty plains of Nebraska. The night was thick, pressing against the windshield of Ethan Cole's 18-wheeler like a living thing. He had been driving for hours, his only companions the occasional bursts of static from the CB radio and the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. It was the kind of lonely drive that made a man question if he was the only soul left on Earth. He was hauling a load of produce from Oregon to Pennsylvania, a long-haul route he had done a dozen times before. But something about this trip felt wrong. Ethan was a seasoned trucker. 15 years on the road had hardened him against the usual fears of the night. But there was something in the air, something electric, a pressure that made the hair on his arms stand on end. His GPS had been acting up for the last 30 miles, recalculating his route to roads he swore he had never seen before. The screen flickered, casting erratic shadows in the cab. He reached for his CB radio, hoping for some chatter from other drivers. "Breaker 19, anyone got ears on this stretch near Interstate 80? Feels like I'm driving into the Twilight Zone." Silence. Then, a crackle. A voice, barely audible through the static. "Don't stop, keep driving." Ethan's breath hitched. The voice was strained, distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. He checked his mirrors. Nothing but the endless road behind him, broken by the occasional set of headlights from some unseen traveler far in the distance. Shaking his head, he chalked it up to exhaustion. He needed to stop soon, find a diner or a truck stop, and refuel both his rig and himself. That's when he saw it. A neon glow pierced through the darkness up ahead, flickering like a dying star. It was an old truck stop, Frank's Rest Haven, a place he didn't recall seeing before on this route. The gas pumps looked outdated, their rusted bodies standing like forgotten sentinels under buzzing fluorescent lights. The diner beside it had a few trucks parked haphazardly out front, their engines off, yet no one seemed to be inside them. The place should have felt like a safe haven, but instead, it sent a prickle of unease down his spine. Ethan pulled in, his tires crunching gravel as he slowed to a stop. The second he killed the engine, an unnatural silence blanketed everything. Even the insects, so loud just moments ago, had gone mute. He stepped out, stretching his legs and rubbing his eyes. The air smelled stale, tinged with something metallic, something wrong. He walked toward the diner, but before he reached the door, he noticed something strange. The trucks parked out front were all running, but no one was inside them. Their engines idled eerily, doors locked, windows fogged over. A sliver of cold fear slid down his spine. He hesitated, debating whether to turn back. But then, the diner's door swung open. A woman in a faded pink waitress uniform stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were too wide, her smile just a little too forced. "Come on in, driver. We've been expecting you." Ethan hesitated at the doorway, his boots rooted to the cracked pavement. The way the woman had said it, "We've been expecting you," made his skin crawl. He forced himself to shake it off. Maybe she just meant it in that friendly small-town diner way. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The place smelled of old grease, coffee, and something else, something faintly coppery beneath it all. The diner was frozen in time, like a snapshot of the 1950s. Vinyl booths lined the walls, a dusty jukebox hummed low in the corner, and a neon "Eat Here or Die Hungry" sign flickered unevenly behind the counter. Despite the warm glow of the overhead lights, the place felt off. There were customers, but they weren't eating. 3 men sat at the counter staring blankly at steaming plates of food, their hands motionless on the formica. A woman in the back booth clutched a cup of coffee so tightly that her knuckles had turned bone white. And the waitress? She hadn't moved from the doorway yet. Ethan cleared his throat. I'll take a coffee. Maybe some eggs and toast." The waitress finally moved, gliding behind the counter like a marionette on strings. She grabbed a chipped ceramic mug and filled it from an old pot that smelled burnt. "You should eat up," she said, sliding the coffee in front of him. Long roads ahead. Ethan tried to ignore the way her fingers lingered on the counter, too pale, too still. He turned his attention to the customers, hoping for some small talk. "Rough stretch of highway out there. Thought I was the only rig on the road," he said, offering a half smile. The 3 men at the counter didn't react. The woman in the back barely blinked. Ethan frowned. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, directing his question to her. She finally looked up. Her eyes were hollow, dark circles sunken deep into her face. She parted her lips as if to speak, but then, bang! The door to the kitchen slammed open, and out walked a man in a grease-stained apron, carrying a steaming plate of food. His face was blank, his eyes milky, and when he placed the food in front of Ethan, a bead of sweat ran down his temple. The plate held a bloody, raw steak, so red it looked freshly carved. Ethan's stomach twisted. "I didn't order this." The cook stared, unblinking. Then, slowly, he reached up and touched his own cheek, and Ethan swore he saw the man's skin shift, like something underneath was moving. The woman in the back booth suddenly jerked forward, her breath ragged. "You need to leave," she rasped. Ethan glanced at the waitress, but she was still smiling, still too still. "What the hell is this place?" he muttered, pushing the plate away. The woman's breath quickened. "Don't you get it?" she whispered. "Look outside." Ethan turned, his pulse hammering. He hadn't noticed it before, but the trucks outside, the ones that had been idling when he arrived, were gone. Every single one of them. The parking lot, which had been filled with rigs just minutes ago, was now an empty stretch of cracked asphalt under flickering lights. His own truck, his entire rig, was gone too. Ethan's breath came shallow. He turned back, but the waitress was gone. So were the 3 men at the counter. So was the cook. Only the woman remained, gripping the table as if trying to anchor herself in reality. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "They took it, you're next." Ethan's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. His truck, his lifeline, was gone. The world outside the diner had become an empty void, the parking lot stretching endlessly beneath the dull hum of the flickering neon sign. His breathing came in short gasps. "Where the hell is my truck?" he demanded, turning to the woman in the back booth. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the entrance as if expecting something or someone to come through at any moment. "You don't get it," she whispered. "You stopped. You weren't supposed to stop." Ethan clenched his fists. "What the hell does that mean? Who took my truck?" The woman's face twisted in something between fear and sorrow. "Not who. What?" Before he could press her further, the jukebox in the corner crackled to life on its own, static bleeding through the old speakers. A song played, some old country tune, warped and distorted like a record spinning too slow. Then, a voice. One last ride, one last stop. Come on out, trucker. It's time to go. Ethan's body locked up. The voice slithered through the diner like an icy wind, pressing against his skull. It was too deep, too smooth, and yet it carried a familiarity that made his stomach twist. The woman shot to her feet. We have to go, now. But before they could move, the diner lights flickered, and the world outside the windows changed. Where the empty lot had been just moments ago, there was now a road, long, twisting, vanishing into an unnatural fog. The pavement was wrong, shifting like ripples in water. And then, slowly from the mist, a truck emerged. It looked like Ethan's rig, same make, same color, but the headlights were too bright, like twin suns burning into the darkness. The grille was splattered with something dark, and the exhaust billowed thick, black smoke. Then he saw it. Something was sitting in the driver's seat. Not a person, not a reflection, something. The shape was twisted, inhuman, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It was wearing a hat, his hat, the one he had left on his dash. The air inside the diner grew dense, suffocating. The woman grabbed Ethan's wrist with icy fingers. If you get in that truck, you're never coming back. Ethan jerked his arm away. Then what the hell am I supposed to do? She licked her lips, glancing between him and the figure in the truck. The engine growled, a sound that wasn't mechanical but organic, like a beast waiting to devour its prey. There's a back door, she said. If we run, we might have a chance. Ethan stared at the truck, his truck, but not. The thing in the driver's seat slowly turned its head toward him, and though he couldn't see its eyes, he felt them, boring into his skull, into his very soul. Then the CB radio, the one mounted inside that thing, crackled to life again. Come on, Ethan. We've got miles to go. His breath hitched. It knew his name. The woman tightened her grip. Now. They bolted. Ethan nearly tore the kitchen door off its hinges as they stumbled into the back alley behind the diner. The air was thick with fog, curling around their legs like fingers reaching out to pull them in. The moment they hit the pavement, the truck's horn blared, shaking the very ground beneath them. The sound was wrong. Not a normal truck horn, but a scream, raw and jagged. Filled with something ancient and hungry, they ran. But behind them, the truck's headlights flared to life, and the chase had begun. The sound of the horn tore through the fog like a blade, rattling Ethan's bones. The pavement beneath his feet felt slick, like he was running across something not entirely solid. The woman, he still didn't know her name, kept a firm grip on his wrist as they sprinted into the unknown, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the truck moved. Not drove, moved. The way it lurched forward was unnatural, like it wasn't rolling on wheels but rather pulling itself along, inching closer despite the thick mist swallowing the road. Its headlights burned too bright, casting long, skeletal shadows that stretched toward them. Ethan dared a glance over his shoulder. The thing in the driver's seat was standing now. Not inside the cab, not sitting behind the wheel. Standing on top of the truck, impossibly tall, its limbs swaying with the motion of the beastly machine. Its head was still tilted at that awful, crooked angle, and though Ethan couldn't see its face, he could feel its grin. A voice slithered from the radio mounted on the truck, smooth as oil and twice as thick. You can't outrun the road, driver. It always catches up. The woman yanked him hard to the right, pulling them off the shifting pavement and into an overgrown field that hadn't been there moments before. Ethan stumbled, his boots tangling in the tall, brittle grass. The truck didn't stop. It tore through the landscape as if the earth itself was bending to accommodate it. Ethan turned to the woman, desperate. Where the hell are we going? She was barely keeping up, her chest heaving. Anywhere but here. The truck's horn blared again, louder this time, splitting the air like a war cry. The fog thickened, pressing against Ethan's skin, seeping into his lungs. His limbs felt heavier with every step. Then, without warning, the woman screamed. Ethan skidded to a stop. She was no longer running beside him. She was sinking. The ground beneath her had opened up, the gaping void swallowing her legs, then her waist. Her nails clawed at the loose earth, her eyes wild with terror. "Help me," she shrieked. Ethan lunged, gripping her wrists. He pulled, gritting his teeth, but something beneath the soil was pulling back. The fog curled around her like tendrils, wrapping around her arms, her throat, dragging her down. Her nails dug into his skin, desperate, pleading, "Don't let them take me." Ethan pulled harder, his muscles burned. The thing on the truck laughed, a deep, guttural sound that rattled his skull. "You can't save everyone, driver." The woman's eyes locked onto his, wide with horror. Then she was gone. The earth sealed itself like she'd never been there. Ethan staggered back, his breath sharp, his hands trembling. He stared at the spot where she had vanished, where just seconds ago she had been alive. The truck lurched closer. The thing on top raised its arms, its unnatural silhouette stretching into the fog. The headlights flared, washing everything in a sickly yellow light. Ethan's mind snapped. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He ran straight toward the truck. The figure on top didn't react, didn't flinch. Ethan leaped, grabbing onto the side mirror, hauling himself up onto the cab. The metal burned cold, searing into his fingers, but he didn't let go. The truck kept moving, its gears shifting under an unseen force. Ethan scrambled to the door and yanked it open. The inside was wrong. Too dark, too deep, too empty. And yet, his hat was still sitting on the dash. The CB radio crackled. "Go on, driver. Take your seat." The world tilted. The fog swirled around him, filling his lungs, his head. His vision blurred. His body felt distant, like he was no longer in control. His hands moved on their own. He climbed inside, sat in the seat. Fingers wrapped around the wheel. The radio crackled once more. Good. Now let's hit the road. The headlights flared. The world outside the windshield stretched and twisted, the pavement shifting into something endless. The diner, the woman, the field, all gone. Only the road remained. Only the road. And Ethan drove. Somewhere on the CB radio frequencies, late at night, truckers claimed to hear a voice. It sounds like a man. A man who's been driving too long, on a road that doesn't exist on any map. A man who never stops. A man who always answers back.